Hey everyone, I'm your host, Emily Lauren. Welcome to the Body Positive Podcast, where we ditch diets, normalize real bodies, and help you feel better in your own skin.
Welcome everyone to the Body Positive Podcast show. Today we have Sarah Lacour on the show. She's a physical therapist and the creator of the Instagram account Deconstructing Purity Culture, which is all about recovering from a lifetime of both diet culture and purity culture. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today, Sarah.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Me too. So let's start off by having you define what purity culture is exactly for those listening who might not have heard the term before.
Absolutely. So purity culture actually refers to a really specific time it was like the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s in the church, and like the white evangelical American church specifically. That was focused significantly on abstinence-only education and purity, quote unquote, which turned into a whole movement and essentially a whole like company, basically. A lot of companies came out of it.
Wow.
But it came actually out of the like HIV and AIDS crisis in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General was actually like a pro-life Christian, but he urged a lot of schools to teach comprehensive sex ed because of the AIDS crisis. And so comprehensive sex ed was taught for a couple of years, and then groups like the Moral Majority and a lot of conservative Christian groups decided that they didn't want their kids being taught comprehensive sex ed or sex ed that included talk about contraceptives and safe sex. And so there was a lot of lobbying that happened.
Wow.
And as a result of it, it ended up kind of becoming a political movement. And eventually in I think it was 1996, there was a Welfare Reform Act that President Clinton signed that actually put aside like $50 or so million a year that went towards abstinence-only education.
Wow.
So it started early and became just like a federally funded thing. And then when George W. Bush became president in 2001, I think, there was a community-based abstinence education kind of group and law that went into action. And it brought federal funding to organizations like Silver Ring Thing, which was one of the companies that kind of started. And then that also got the Southern Baptist Convention to start the company True Love Waits. So it started as a very corporate kind of capitalistic thing that got federal funding. And eventually the federal funding kind of petered out. And slowly we started to kind of come back more towards comprehensive sex ed, safe sex, that kind of thing. But like the damage was done, and abstinence-only education was taught exclusively in schools in America for a good 30 years. And even now, I did a post about it recently, but there's really not even that many states that teach comprehensive sex ed now. So it's kind of been a long-standing thing. And specifically purity culture that came out of that, it not only focuses on abstinence-only education, but it also focuses on virginity specifically being kind of a measure of worth and being a measure of something to give or take away from your future spouse. And it focused a lot on modesty as well. So it kind of encompasses a lot of things, but it's crazy that it was federally funded for a long time.
Wow. And the focus is obviously more on women being the keepers of their virginity and modesty. Is that correct?
Yes. So a lot of times it focused a lot more on women being kind of gatekeepers for virginity. The phrase that I was taught a lot and that I've come to realize a lot of people were taught, not just me, was that we had to protect our like brothers in Christ and we didn't want to be a stumbling block, quote unquote. And so that's kind of where a lot of the modesty teaching came in, was that you didn't want to be a stumbling block for your brothers in Christ, so you needed to cover up, basically.
Absolutely. So what inspired you to basically recover from this way of thinking?
Honestly, I got married. So that was kind of the biggest thing. I got married, and I remember telling my husband on our honeymoon, like, what the heck? Like, what were we, like, we went our whole lives feeling so guilty for having any kind of, like, sexual thoughts or feelings at all. And then all of a sudden, we're just supposed to turn all that off overnight.
Yeah, flip
and
a
suddenly,
switch, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like not quite how our brains and bodies work. So I started talking to some of my friends about it, and specifically, like, I remember talking to my best friend, and we were in a Chipotle, and we were like whispering because we didn't want anybody to hear us talking about sex. And we were like, wait, this is weird. Like, we shouldn't be ashamed to have to talk about this. So it kind of started in like a lot of different conversations with friends, and then eventually I ended up doing a writing mentorship with a friend of mine, and this topic just kept coming up over and over again. So finally I was like, apparently I'm not the only one that went through this. I need to kind of talk about this.
Absolutely. I went to Catholic school, and a lot of what you've said on your Instagram account really resonates with me as well, even though, like, I wouldn't say it was like a very like in your face religious school. My parents were very open-minded and fairly flexible, so I kind of got a bit of both, right? And it really it made us feel like we were objects, and I think that's really played into a lot of my interest in body image and why I chose to study that and write about that. Because with purity culture, girls are always responsible for other people's actions. Why is this so problematic, and what can we do about it as a society?
So it's problematic because, like you said, it puts women, and especially young girls, as the sole owners of like responsibility for other people's actions, which is terrible to teach people, especially young girls. It actually, I just recently did a post and did a bunch of research about sexual assault narratives that were kind of taught, and how people who grew up in purity culture are actually unable to like recognize normal kind of sexual abuse and rape narratives. And so when you grow up constantly being told that your body is a stumbling block to somebody else, or your body is bad, basically, you have to cover up your body, you have to like take care of other people by covering your body, then you kind of start to develop a lot of body image issues, especially things like body dysmorphia and eating disorders and disordered eating. And so it just it like spirals almost and turns into a whole other situation that I don't think the church a lot of times is equipped to deal with, and doesn't really know quite how to deal with. And in general, you know, we know that teaching young girls, especially, you know, pre-puberty and just hitting puberty, young women, that if their bodies are bad, or if teaching them certain narratives about their body, that sticks for a really long time. And so, when a lot of us grew up in this, like, that's kind of what we grew up thinking. And even now, like, I'm in my 30s, and it still is difficult to like wear a bikini or wear shorts because of the things that I was taught as such a young girl. So it's a like kind of deeply ingrained process basically in your brain.
It's like that whole blame the victim mentality, you know, like instead of teaching boys about respect and not to rape, essentially, right, or not to objectify, we're teaching girls that they're responsible for boys' actions. That's like the thing with dress codes. They drive me nuts. I wish that I had known what I know now back in high school, because I would have shouted from the rooftops, because, you know, it's ridiculous. I remember a teacher calling me out, and I wore a kilt in my high school, and I had shorts on underneath, right? So at the end of the day, whether I was or wasn't, it shouldn't matter, but they used me as an example of how not to dress. And I remember,
oh, that's horrifying.
And like I remember thinking, like, it was behind my back, luckily, because it was a friend who was with the teacher. But I couldn't believe it, and thinking about it now,
Yeah.
I would have made such a stink. I would have gone and reported the teacher. And, if it was my kid, I would have gone to the ends of the earth to make them feel like, you know what, you can wear what you want on your body. So
exactly.
Religious doctrines like the Bible can be misused to further this agenda or this idea that's all about controlling women's bodies. What are some examples of this that you've come across?
I think the biggest one that I've come across, there's two of them. One of them is a verse in the Bible that, of course, now I'm blanking on exactly where
That's always what happens.
Yeah.
But...
It's in there. I just can't remember it exactly. But it basically says, treat your body like a temple.
Yes.
And so a lot of times that can be used for really good things, and it can be used for taking care of yourself, getting enough sleep, doing self-care.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, within purity culture and within a lot of these kind of toxic teachings like that, it was used to teach us that our bodies were bad naturally. Yes. And that if we gained weight, or if we went through puberty early, or if we had any kind of sexual thoughts or feelings that were totally normal, that was us not treating our bodies like a temple.
Yes. Even the story of Adam and Eve comes to mind too, right? She was the temptress. And,
exactly.
the reason that we have sin, and instead of just understanding that humans are flawed and that it can be beautiful, and, we should be able to embrace our sexuality and who we are.
Yeah, exactly. And the other one that comes to mind too is there are a couple of verses that talk about honoring God with your body and not giving into what I think Paul calls sexual immorality and things like that. And so unfortunately, a lot of those were also used against us, especially women, to tell us that, like you said, any kind of normal sexual thoughts or feelings that are completely developmentally normal and natural and okay, we were told that those were bad, and that any kind of acting on those, even just having a crush on a boy or going on a date or something like that, if you were holding hands, that could be seen as leading somebody on, or it could be seen as, how far are you going to take this? Where is the line?
Tempting, right?
Yes, exactly. We were stumbling blocks, basically. And so for someone like me who, I went through puberty crazy early, and I had curves that none of my friends had, and I was taller than all of my friends. I'm not taller anymore, but I was, as a small child. But I stuck out like a sore thumb. And so to constantly have my teachers, I went to a really small Christian school until 8th grade. So to have my teachers be constantly telling me, you need to cover yourself up, or what you're wearing isn't appropriate, or you're going to be tempting the boys, and using Bible verses to back that up. It was horrifying. It just gave me such a skewed perspective of what the Bible actually says about our bodies, and what how I should feel about my body, and just body positivity in general.
Exactly. And you mentioned that purity culture played a role in developing body dysmorphia. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in general, purity culture doesn't really teach body autonomy or even medically accurate sex ed.
Yes.
And it especially doesn't teach anatomy of any kind. A lot of times it's very shameful to talk about anatomy. And so there is, like I said, a huge emphasis in purity culture on taking care of your body, treating your body as a temple. And so it gave at least me the impression, and a lot of other people that I've talked to, that people were hyper fixated on my body. Yeah. And so because of that, one, I kind of learned how to disconnect from my body and not connect to it really in any way. And two, I thought that everybody was judging my body. And my counselor will always tell me, oh no, nobody's, looking at you or thinking at you the way that you're looking at or thinking about yourself. But in purity culture, that wasn't true. People were looking at me, and teachers were judging me and, telling me that I needed to wear, especially a dress for a graduation ceremony. It had to be higher up on my neckline and things like that. So to have it reinforced that people were hyperfixated on your body.
Of course.
It just I developed this weird sense of my body. I didn't know really what it looked like. I didn't know what was accurate and what wasn't accurate. And so that led into a really long struggle with body dysmorphia and an eating disorder, because I was also told, like, because I was going through puberty and had curves that my friends didn't have, like, obviously I wasn't taking care of my body the way that I was supposed to.
Yeah.
And so it's just it's like a vicious cycle that kind of keeps going and going. Yeah. But I've heard from so many women since starting this account in like March that they also were dealing with body dysmorphia because of purity culture, because they were taught to disconnect from their bodies in so many ways.
I think there's such a link, even going back in time, there's such a link just in terms of the way society views women, which is tied historically to religion. I've been doing a little bit of research on that lately myself, and I just, it's like women, we live in this constant state of a contradiction, you know, be like this but not like that, and you're never good enough, and that just creates so much shame. You know, what are some ways that you think we can teach girls that it's okay to be themselves, to be real, to embrace whatever body that they have?
I love that. I think honestly the biggest one is just teaching girls about their anatomy, like teaching like medically accurate terms, and starting those conversations early. Like I'm a physical therapist now, and so I talk to my patients about their bodies all the time, and even like my old patients, the discomfort that they have in talking about their own body is so palpable. And so even just starting the conversations early with kids about, you know, I've seen them like on, you know, TikTok and Instagram called like body talks, but starting the conversations early about like your body is your own and your body is good, but you know, also teaching consent with that, and you don't want anybody to touch your body that you don't want to touch your body, or so things like that. I mean, I think that's a really big one, and also just modeling it for like younger girls and younger women. I see a lot of people on Instagram talk about how they don't want their daughters to see them talking negatively about their body, and so about like their own body, so they're talking positively about their bodies in front of their kids so that their kids don't see, you know, their mom hyperfixated and then kind of internalize that and think like, oh, my mom doesn't like that about herself, so I must not like that either, which I think is how a lot of us unfortunately ended up with learned, you know, body dysmorphia and eating disorder.
Yeah, no, that's so important. And like you were saying, having those early conversations are really critical. And there are studies out there that actually prove that the more educated we are about sexuality, for example, the more safer our kids will be. So talking about sex is a good thing. The opposite is the case. You know, there's more early pregnancies and things like that when you don't know enough about it, and it's just this shameful thing that you can participate in.
Exactly. So, I think it was. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think in one of the studies I was looking at recently, it actually talked about how the rate of teen pregnancy went down in the 90s or like early 80s and 90s, when there was an emphasis on comprehensive sex ed and contraception, and like the rate of teen pregnancy plummeted because people understood. And then when abstinence only was taught, the rate of teen pregnancy skyrocketed again because like girls didn't know, and they also didn't have anybody to talk to about it, and they didn't know what contraception was even available. So it's, I mean, education, like just sex ed in general, is so important, but especially like reinforcing it at home is even more important.
Absolutely. And there's this issue with sex seemingly always being linked to morality. And I know, like, even growing up in a Catholic school, I still think about that sometimes, which is so odd to me, even though I feel like I'm so past a lot of those thoughts, but they do creep in every once in a while, you know, like this is bad, even if I'm the one deciding and I'm the one who, you know, is in control of my body. And it's really problematic that, you know, girls grow up thinking all these wrong things about sex, which is that they should be learning that it's enjoyable and prepare them to make those decisions for themselves, as opposed to just avoiding, you know?
And what's crazy too is that it like is so much reinforced in the media, especially in like the early 2000s. There was such an emphasis on Disney stars having purity rings, like specifically. And all of these Disney stars and people like Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera and Justin Timberlake and all these things being asked in interviews, like, are you having sex? Are you saving yourself for marriage? What are you doing? Like,
and they were like 17, right?
Yeah, they were all minors.
Yeah.
And like the Jonas Brothers having, purity rings, it was this whole, like, it was a constant conversation, but the conversation from the media was the same as like, you need to be saving yourself for marriage. If you're not saving yourself for marriage, you're disappointing somebody, like, or you're, not a good person, or you're all these, disparaging terms for women. And it just got reinforced in so many different places and so many different ways. And I think it's great now over the past few years to have like the internet, but also like podcasts and Instagram accounts and all these things like promoting body positivity and sex positivity and just like ideas to kind of re-educate people essentially into a better reality for thinking about their bodies and teaching their kids about their bodies too.
I agree. I always say I've got a 4-year-old daughter, or an almost 4-year-old daughter, and a 6-year-old son, and I like to think of them as my guinea pigs sometimes, because I'm like, you are going to grow up with no guilt and no shame when it comes to your body and your sexuality, and I'm doing everything I can to have those conversations early on, because I do not want them to grow up feeling guilty. And it's funny because I remember my mom in high school having a conversation with me, and she wanted me to be safe, and if I was gonna have sexual relations, she said it would be better if it's with someone that cares about me and things like that. But she said, I don't want you to have the same guilt that I felt growing up. And it's funny because
so nice.
it was nice, but I think even now, the way we think about it, it's like women can have multiple sexual partners. They don't have to be with someone that cares about them.
Exactly.
They can decide. And I think, the conversation gets reframed and changed, but I hope at least with a lot of people, we're opening our eyes to the fact that women should be empowered to have their own sexuality. And there is a difference between being sexualized and being sexual.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think it's great to see like big companies also realizing this, even if it's just because people are putting pressure on them. But like, I think Pinterest last week said we're not going to promote weight loss anymore.
Yes, I'm so happy.
I was so excited. Like to take, diet culture totally out of the mix in that case is massive. And to have, companies like Aerie saying we're not going to Photoshop our models, and we're also going to show you models that are real people and look like the majority of women that are buying from our stores, is so impressive, because it's going so against at least what we were raised with.
Exactly.
But
Take away all that
showing
shame.
It's showing kids that like we can live in a world without being completely dominated by diet culture and purity culture all at the same time.
Exactly. And they're so interconnected, right?
Oh yeah. They're pretty much just the same circle on a Venn diagram.
Yeah, just used for different purposes, but always to control women's bodies, right?
Exactly. And like just shame, all the shame. That's all it is.
Exactly. So if someone is struggling with recovering from purity culture, what are some resources that they can turn to, other than, of course, your Instagram page, which is amazing?
Thank you. I am a big reader, so I always recommend books. I have a whole post about some of my favorite books, I believe, on my account. If not, I will make one. But the biggest one, honestly, it's called Pure by Linda K. Klein. And it's basically a history of purity culture, but she was raised in purity culture. And so it's her kind of going back to people that she was raised with and interviewing them about purity culture. And then she also includes interviews from a ton of women that she got like while she was writing the book about their experiences. So, I mean, that for me helped me feel much less alone, to know that like this was an issue with the whole country. And then to kind of like, I read that one first, and then the next book to kind of go off of that is Sheila Gregor's book, The Great Sex Rescue, that just came out a few months ago. It's incredible. She is a researcher, and she interviewed, I'm going to get the number wrong, but some like tens of thousands of women.
Wow.
And also looked at the messaging in some of the most popular purity culture books and kind of compiled a ton of research basically showing like how purity culture affected women and how it affected their sex lives and how it affected their views on their bodies, and ways to kind of like reconnect to your body. It's a fantastic book. In general, Sheila Gregor is a great follow.
Yeah.
She just does so much good work for like just the research, like the science behind like this is legitimate. Like this really harmed a lot of people. And a couple of other books are like Shameless by Nadia Bolz-Weber, and Beyond Shame by Matthias Roberts. Those are really good ones just to kind of like,
that sounds fascinating. I can't wait to read all these now.
I was gonna say, I have a whole list. I made a list over the weekend and put it on my Instagram story, and then I kept getting questions about it, so I'm probably gonna have to repost that at some point.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. That sounds so great, and it's so appreciated that you've pulled together all these resources, and I love your little posts on just facts and stats and just things that, you know, it's like you're reading my mind and reading the culture I've grown up with, and I just think it's so refreshing. And I actually found you through Shaylee Muir, who is one of my favorite body positive influencers and sort of an online friend of mine. So
that's awesome. Thank you.
So I'm so glad that I stumbled across your page because of her. And so lastly, I just want to ask you if you could offer one tip to our listeners. What would that be?
Oh, that's such a good question.
I always like to stump people at the end with that one.
I know. One tip to your listeners. I think, okay, this is a tip that my my counselor makes me do.
Those are best.
So have fun. Spend 1 hour a day naked.
I love it.
Just to connect to your body. And she always tells me to like do something that I like. So I'm like, I'll read a book and just be naked.
Yeah.
Or like, I'll like walk around my house, whatever it is. We don't have all the blinds up, so I can't do that 100%. But just to like reconnect to your body and learn that like your body is okay exactly how it is, and it moves in certain ways, and it's, you know, you sit and it falls a certain way, and that's okay. It is your body and it is what it is. But it's a good way of like, it's kind of an embodiment practice, but it's also just really good grounding to be like, this is my body in my environment.
You get comfortable with what has made you uncomfortable almost, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And lastly, of course, please tell us where we can find you online.
Yeah, so I am at Deconstructing Purity Culture on Instagram, and that is the main place that I post a few times a week, just to everything that I'm researching and learning, basically.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with me today, and I can't wait for everyone to listen to this episode and feel heard and understood.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun.
Once again, thanks for listening to today's episode. Make sure you follow us at Real Happy Daughter, and please share this with someone who needs a little more real in their life.